Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Community Connection. I'm one of your hosts, Vicki Casella, licensed professional counselor, here with my wonderful co-host, Mark Kenny. How are you this morning, Mark?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Vicki, and looking forward to today's show.
Me too. So before we get started, just our normal disclaimer, if anyone who's listening or watching, if you are dealing with any severe mental health symptoms or concerns, we always encourage you to reach out to therapist, doctor, crisis worker, hospital, whoever's in your support system to help guide you through that. Today's guest, Dr. Eleonora Bartoli. I got it?
Bartoli, but that's
Bartoli.
Great. That's fine.
Bartoli. Okay. I'm going to practice that more. Okay. So she is, despite me not being able to say her name the correct way, she is a psychologist and a consultant specializing in trauma, resilience building, and social justice. Right?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
100%.
So she had written a recent blog on her website, and the title, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Healing and Resistance, Antidotes to Oppression. Is that the title?
Yes.
Okay.
Beautiful.
And that's pretty much it's stemming our conversation. That's where our conversation is gonna stem from that blog that you've written. So where would you like to start with that? What would you like to start sharing from that article?
Well, it depends on what you think might be helpful. And I think one of the things we've talked about is speaking a little bit about where I come from philosophically, both counseling and social justice wise, so that you can see how the lens that I use to really approach the conversation.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
That sounds good.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm fascinated with neuroscience and with how our bodies work. And partly that's because I'm a trauma therapist. So trauma in its original language really just means wound. So something, when we talk about trauma, I mean, there's something out there that is wounding us, that is causing an injury of some sort. Not all trauma becomes PTSD, which I think some people think of trauma as automatically a diagnosis. It's just really a word to understand that something out there has an impact that is not so pleasant on us. And our bodies are absolutely beautifully made to help us navigate a rocky world. This is fundamentally how we are, how I think of ourselves as human beings. So a trauma-informed lens simply says that when a threat comes to us, so we're endowed with this amazing threat detection system. And that detection system is fully operational from the moment we are born, for all practical purposes, because it keeps us safe. So our bodies are very kind and tries to keep us safe. And that threat detection mechanism engenders three reactions. So something comes to us, we either flight, fight, or freeze. We fight if we think we can win. We flight if we think we can outrun the danger, right? And we freeze if we think we can't win and we can't run away on time. And so our body shuts down, that's the freeze response, because it tries to make it less painful to withstand whatever is coming to us. So our body doesn't do that to betray us, to torture us. It does that because it's trying to protect us. Now, those reactions kind of do us. We don't always get to choose them. They're more instinctive. And so they can feel like, you might have went off the handle, or you might have just kind of withdrew very quickly, or you might have felt like, why didn't I do anything? And then in hindsight, we look back and say, well, what's wrong with me? And I say, nothing. Your body was just trying to protect you in that moment, right? And so this is one side of the conversation. I think that's the side of the conversation that we hear the most. The other side, those are moments. Those were always designed to be just moments to protect us for whatever threat they would come. But the other side of it, which I find completely fascinating, people say that, oh, human beings are intrinsically evil and they don't like each other and we are afraid of each other. And actually, that's not true, because our best thriving, and I mean biologically, that also then shows up psychologically and emotionally because we're biological beings, that comes out of loving each other. And I mean loving with a capital L, which means when we care for each other, when I care for somebody else, or when they care for me, there's a whole series of chemical reaction that I actually need to be well. So I can't be well on my own. You know, we think that COVID-19 has created this sense of interconnection. We're now interconnected. We've always been. We can't be well emotionally nor physically. And we know because children can die if they don't are cared for, even though they're fed and they're clean. But if they're not actually loved, they don't survive physically. So as well. So on the one hand, yes, we kind of have this really big threat reaction, which, by the way, those threat systems, it's what oppression and white supremacy, if we don't mind using that term, uses to scare us, because it is a powerful, powerful system in our body. But the love that we can nurture for each other has an incredibly positive impact. So everything I say comes out of those two foundation. And the other foundation is, you know, counseling has gone through many incarnations, and I'm very much of an integrationalist, and I take from what really think that works, not what I think, what science says that works from various traditions. But I ground my work very solidly in what's thought of as social justice, or sometimes it's named as liberation counseling, but the social justice perspective. So the medical model says you got a symptom, you know, for us is anxiety, depression. And so pretty much the medical model asks, what's wrong with you? You know, and tries to take that symptom away. And sometimes that's fine, but I like to ask what a trauma-informed perspective tells us is, what happened to you? So again, if we go by the fact that our bodies are not betraying us, for the most part, our bodies are trying to send us signals. Emotions are signals. There's something out there, it's not fitting. And so what happened to you that anxiety arose? What happened to you that depression grips you, right? So there's signals that alert us to something. So you're investigating. All of a sudden, when I used to teach, I said, it's not, I taught counseling students for a number of years. I said, not all symptoms are between the 2 ears, meaning in your head. You know, much of it comes from the outside world. So what happens to you? And so the investigation is not what's wrong with you, but it's like, what's your environment like? That's a big shift. And so for me to help you, by definition, I can help you become more resilient to your environment. But if I don't help you to push back on an environment that might not be healthy for you, what am I really doing? Making you more adapt to an unjust system? I mean, that doesn't seem very therapeutic, right? Yeah. So the social justice lens kind of flips the ways in which we understand symptoms and empowers, by definition, empowers people to become more resilient, because unfortunately injustices are going to continue. And also, as we look at, I'm sure we'll talk about, to speak up and push back. And so really, how is therapy not resistance? Therapy by definition is resistance. So that's I could say a lot more, but that's sort of my 3 pillars that I base much of what I'm thinking about on.
Wonderful. I love the explanation. I was taking lots of notes.
Lovely. It reminds me of my teaching days.
Yeah.
Really nice.
Wonderful.
Well, I think going back to from those pillars, then, how did you? I know you do work in practice, but you also do consulting, and you also do group work where you invite people to work on these issues. So how do you then put this into action? Then how do you take this philosophy, and can you give us an example of how you then implement this, either in a therapeutic setting or maybe in one of your group, closed-end group practices that you do?
Yeah, so we can go into more detail about where I might derive specifically some of those, so whether it's a workshop or whether it is a counseling session in terms of the kinds of issues that might arise. But so in a counseling session, for example, I'll give you 2 examples. You know, one thing that we often say, and I used to say and take very much at face value, that if somebody is overwhelmed, I'm going to help them soothe, right? I'm going to help them access self-care. Now, self-care can be beautiful, and I'm a huge advocate of it. However, if self-care simply, again, soothing makes you suppress an accurate and appropriate reaction to something out there, see what I'm doing? I'm actually enabling even more injury to come to that person. So that's a time where I'm going to say, and explicitly analyze and discuss the situation that perhaps not coming from within, not coming from without, and how feasible it is to put some boundaries around it. What kind of muscles would be good to develop to counteract it, and how much can we begin transforming it? So that's a counseling process. So another example that I often use is when we do cognitive behavior therapy, we're trying to impact people's thinking when the thinking doesn't help. So one example I always give is when I became a mother, and it took me a while to begin thinking of myself as a mother and a professional. So I felt inadequate when I was at work because, and notice this is from somebody who taught women's studies at a college level. So still, it's all internalized. It doesn't come just from your head. You're living these principles. So I used to say, I felt very inadequate at work because I felt like I was not mothering enough. And then I felt very inadequate as a mother because I wasn't contributing enough to my work. So I couldn't find goodness in both. Now, if I lived in a male body, I was assigned female at birth and I experienced myself as female. If I had been assigned as a male at birth and I experienced myself as a male, like my partner, he felt great at work as a provider and great at home because anything you do as a father in the way stereotypically is like it's an added bonus. It's awesome. He is like top of the world. So my feelings about guilt or distress were not in my head. I didn't make that paradigm up about motherhood. So if somebody has said, well, let me restructure your thinking, your guilt is an inappropriate thought. Well, actually, no, it's not an appropriate thought. So what you deconstruct as you're thinking, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that, needs to be understood in terms of where did you get that thinking from? Who does it benefit? Who does it serve? And who does it not serve, and why?
Right.
So those are the questions that come up both clinically, for me, there's not such a thing as a neutral stance in a clinical setting, because again, if you take neutral just means decontextualizing. When you decontextualize, you're actually hiding what's underneath it. So you have to be able to look at it. And one thing I would say to all clinicians or all clients is that I can only help you insofar as I see it. So if I don't live and I don't analyze those principles in my own life, and I don't understand how they play out in my own mind, then I can't see it in yours. So I'm only truly as good as my wokeness, whatever that means. And it's a never-ending journey path.
Right.
So I'm going to say one more example. So one of the workshops that I do is for white women, and how can they become more effective in their anti-racist work. So as white women, we often are the ones who speak a good talk and have all the good intention. And when it comes to actually actualize it in the moment of being that presents itself, that the opportunity presents to speak up, we back out. And what we don't understand is that there's a lot of what we don't realize. We think, well, why didn't I do that? Or we get very defensive, which of course drives everybody around us, especially our wonderful BIPOC allies, crazy. And one of my sort of arguments is that we have a very specific place within white supremacy. We have a very specific role within it. And if we don't acknowledge that we ourselves are threatened, then our bodies will do flight, fight, freeze. And it doesn't matter how much good intentions are, because our mind goes forward, our body yanks us back, and then our mind, takes the flight signals and begins doing exactly the opposite of what I had intended just 10 minutes prior. And so this is just one of the ways in which in my consulting work, I integrate the sense that if we don't begin understanding that we have a beautifully designed body that's trying to keep us safe, then we can't increase our resilience to enter unsafe places. Now, in terms of social justice action, it's intrinsically unsafe. So one, I need my fear to know when I'm stepping over that boundary and I'm actually doing good anti-racist or anti-white supremacist action, but I also need to train, otherwise my body will yank me back. So at the end of the month, I have a workshop for white women that I'm offering again, but and all the information are either on my website or people can contact me through social media or email. But that's the distinction between we're only a head or we're only a body or there's no context actually doesn't allow for real healing, doesn't allow for real growth. It doesn't allow for impactful or powerful resistance.
Yeah, as I hear you talking, I mean, I'm going in about 15 different directions of theory. So I'm hearing Lev Vygotsky and social constructionism in terms of the voices just aren't from, you know, in counseling and psychology, sometimes we just get stuck at the family systems level, and not that the voices are also coming from larger systems, which then gets you into the multidimensional aspect of bidirectional development. We don't develop in a vacuum, and we pick up a whole lot of messages that we didn't ask for, but that we then have to, they get uncovered as we move along and we live our lives. So, I mean, I just, in a recent discussion, we talked about the idea of the group in power, and we're talking about white supremacy here, controls the narrative. So how does that play into the work that you're doing in helping people understand that there is this larger cultural narrative, as you're saying, that creates injury for others, and then for others makes them, you know, not know how to engage, or silences them, or freezes them, or they want and not engage. So how does that work into your work in terms of that, you know, who controls the narrative, whatever group, whatever power structure controls the narrative has, you know, has influence over that system?
Yes. So I'm going to go in the narrative direction, and then if you want me to go in the
you may pick whatever direction you like.
Of oppression direction, you let me know. So I'll start with the narrative because it's closer to where you're heading it. So narratives are very, very powerful, and for anybody who has experienced CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, either as a therapist because you're using it, or as a client because you have received that kind of care and treatment, you know that narratives and thoughts are very, very powerful. There is Brian Stevenson, who is the author of Just Mercy and the Equal Justice Initiative. It's an incredible organization he has created, and people can just Google it and find more information about it. But he says when it comes to racism, that we are losing the narrative war. We have won the policy war to some extent, but we are losing the narrative war. What it means is that if you control the story, you control reality, because we really believe in stories. There's a great quote, and I cannot remember where I read it. You know, we often say, well, if I see, I believe. Actually, that's not true in terms of cognitive psychology. If I believe, I see. If I believe, I see. So I only see what I actually believe. And that's all of us. I'm not immune to that. You know, I can only know that I'm doing it to the extent that I'm aware that I'm doing it, but we are all doing it. So as we know, thoughts engender really strong feelings. And the one thing that I encourage folks to do very, very much so is to ask themselves the question, what role is this thought playing, and who is it serving in the wider echelons? So if I, as a white woman, buy into the fact that I'm powerless and weak and don't have really my voice and this kind of sexist ideals, then who does that benefit when I enter a situation when I'm witnessing injustice? What happens to my body when I think I'm going to be overpowered? And how am I going to then respond if I buy into it? So it creates a level of helplessness or paralysis. So my buying into certain concepts about myself, who does it benefit? What really benefits the status quo? If I don't step into the danger because I don't think I can, if I don't train myself to work within, to step outside of the role that white supremacy has assigned me, then I'm not going to be able to disrupt it. So who does it serve? So there might be some, so I don't have a priori preference for what people believe. but none of our beliefs are neutral. They don't lead to neutral outcomes. So
Yeah.
feeling that you are, or thinking, oh, I'm not enough, could be really good, because you really need to join. Like, yes, you're not enough, because in fact, none of us individually is enough. First of all, we can't be well on our own within each other.
Right.
Second of all, we're not enough because I cannot fight white supremacy by myself. It's a numbers game, and it's a layered game. It's how many places do we disrupt this so it begins to crumble, in a way that we also support folks in the meantime.
Right.
Which is a whole other conversation. But so, however, if me feeling, oh, there's nothing I can do, that just makes me do nothing, well, that's not very functional. So again, the question I always invite folks to ask themselves, what role does the belief play in your life? What emotion does it engender? And what role does that emotion then play in your life? How can you move into action, move into wellness, move into care for each other, move into truth, move into reality, which reality is scary. So what supports you in that? So that's how I think about the role, which again, you can think about in CBT terms, but CBT might make it very personal. Like, what's wrong with you for feeling you're weak?
Right.
Like, well,
Right.
that is not always helpful. You can, it goes back to not the decontextualizing symptoms serves the status quo.
Right. Right. It's not the and both. It's just focusing on either or, and it's not the and both that you had to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I love both and.
And the narrative that you're describing, that kind of leads right into that loving kindness approach that you talk about in your blog, right? Like, there's the connection between that.
Yes. And so maybe I'll take a step back before I go there in saying, why is the practice like the loving kindness actually helpful in the larger scheme? So sometimes when we look at mindfulness-based therapies or mindfulness-based supports and practices, those practices often enough are also decontextualized. So we use them to soothe, not to empower. And so nothing wrong with soothing as long as you know what you're soothing, what function soothing then has in the larger context. So I want to contextualize how we might get to a loving kindness practice so that people know when and how to practice in a way that it's ultimately empowering and healing for them. So when I think about how injustice works, it has what I think of, and you can slice this in different ways. But one way in which it can be sliced, there's a great, of course I cannot remember the name of the author, but he's a statistician who says all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is one of those. It is not a complete, absolute truth model, but it's a useful one. So if you think about oppression and trauma, works actually have this similar mechanisms and similar, I call them weapons, but they're really similar mechanisms that they utilize to have an injurious impact. And so the first thing that they do is separate us from our body. So trauma separates us from our body. It does it in a number of ways. If you think in an extreme way, what does trauma or oppression does, it literally kills you. We only have to remember George Floyd, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and many others were in high and present in our consciousness that they have been, it's been the ultimate separation to their bodies. But you can also be separated to your body by being separated to your mind, for example, from your mind. So from your beliefs. So you might be told you're not a good person. You might be told you're not enough fully human. You might be told that you're not worthy of love. You're not worthy of care. There's a beautiful book called Dignity that is about conflict resolution. But we are intrinsically worthy and have intrinsic dignity. Every one of us, every living being, and there's lots of backing on why that's the case. But so when we are when injustice comes our ways, that's how it separates us from our own sense of ourselves, and that's more internal. It also separates us from our community. So when you think about certain kinds of abuse, you get separated the first time, especially domestic violence or certain kinds of family abuse, they separate you. The person who perpetrates the abuse, the first move is to separate you from your loved ones. So it's a beginning of separation from your community. We see with detention centers where parents are separated from children. If as a white person, I am told that I should not enter spaces where BIPOCs live, Black, Indigenous, and people of color live, because that's dangerous for me. So I'm separated from other human beings. If a BIPOC person enters a primarily white neighborhood, they are in fact in danger. I may not be in danger in their neighborhood, in fact, but they might be very well be in danger in a primarily white neighborhood. And then the one that breaks my heart the most is that we are pinned against each other in groups that could be allied. So separation, it's really a very pervasive, strategic way in which injustice and oppression are operationalized. It's essential to implementing it. And the other thing that is really important, if I speak truth, then oppression can't operate. So I need to be silenced. And that happens in all sorts of ways. I mean, you just open the news, you see gaslighting, invalidating, censoring, fake news. I mean, the whole thing. Who knows what truth is these days, you know? So the moment you silence, the moment you hide, then your narrative prevails. Whatever the narrative you have, and the narrative has power, frames reality, is the model you're going to use. And that, you know, BIPOCs are dangerous. Then I, as a white woman especially, it's a huge rhetoric. I must be protected, and then violence is warranted. This is how this all kind of connects to each other, right? And then the last thing we know because of trauma theory, because we know from biology, terror paralyzes. So those moments of public executions, the moments of public terror, what we're mostly terrorized, what our body is most afraid of is dying, is being injured. That's evolutionarily encoded in our very being. And so it paralyzes us. When I see overpowering violence, I know I can flee it as a woman, and I know I can fight it by myself. It paralyzes me. And so if I'm paralyzed, of course, then I'm helpless, then I don't act. My power is taken away, so I don't use it. Whether I think I don't have it or whether I really don't have it, at that point, it doesn't matter because I'm just not using it. So those are very effective way. One of the folks I've been following for a while now is Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, Kydo Williams, Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams. She, they, those are their pronouns, is a Zen priest, but also a Black queer activist and an amazing theorizer around the dynamics of white supremacy, which is founded on anti-Blackness. And so a lot of the fact that a lot of my connections between the psychological principle that I was taught or that I was teaching and some of the insidious ways in which it connects to oppression and connects to the way we function physically and psychologically, really she's the one that has enabled me to make some of those connections. So I highly recommend their book, Radical Dharma. It's co-authored with other wonderful, wonderful thinkers. So I highly recommend her book. So back to your question, Vicky, thank you for asking. It's a long detour. So what we have to do both practically in terms of narrative, we have to look for narratives that reconnect, right? We have to look for narratives that allow us to speak up and being heard. Super important, both sides, speaking up and being heard. And then we have to look for narratives that allow us to re-engage with our power and act. So narratives that do that, and then practices that do that. That's where I say, well, function does it play, whatever thought you have in your head. Does it engender action? Then great. Does it engender more paralysis? Not so good. I am all for, righteous indignation, fantastic. But if it actually injures you and others, maybe not so helpful, you know. But if it ignites your love and your action and your power, beautiful. So it depends on how you use it as a tool. And so the loving kindness has two functions, really. The loving kindness practice, first of all, you can look at the Stanford Project. It's probably one of the places where neuroscience has done the most research of the impact of loving kindness on our brain functioning and how wonderful it is. It's like medicine. It's literally medicine for us. It's much of the mindfulness techniques, which are also I was taught they were called fourth wave behaviorism. Somebody used the term recently, third wave CBT, and I don't know which one it is, but psychologists adopt a lot of this practice from some more Eastern practices, but we have adapted it to as counseling tools. And so the loving kindness, it's a way to re-engender empathy. Now think about where we started this conversation. We have the fly, fight, freeze, evolutionary. We have the system fully developed, embodied in us. And then we have to practice and we have to stimulate in each other this other system, which we have full capacity for. Every one of us is born with full capacity for it. It just doesn't get developed unless we foster it. And the entire wellness, physically and psychologically for us, is based on that other system. One keeps us safe, one makes us well. You see the difference. And so the loving kindness is one of those practices that engenders and gives a workout and empowers the wellness system. So originally the practice is 5 parts, and the last blog on my website, which is dreleonorabartoli.com, is dr and then my full name.com. That last blog has the actual practice embedded in it. So I made a 5-minute practice of it, so it's easy enough and short enough for people to get a taste of it. You can find many versions of the practice. And I like the idea that one of them, which I think is true, it's actually culturally adapted for us in the West. We in the West, so the 5 layers to the practice. You send wishes, just good wishes to yourself, to a loved one, to a neutral person that you don't feel either way about, to an enemy, and then to the whole world. So you're expanding your capacity to send goodness out. And it's not dangerous. To love somebody in your heart is not dangerous, but we feel it is dangerous. And then that sends us back into the fly, fight, freeze. So it's a muscle where internally we open up. It doesn't mean we don't put boundaries when somebody's trying to hurt us, but internally we keep ourselves open to the goodness. And that's what the practice is really about. And I think that's the impact, the biological impact that it has on us. So in the West, however, we have a very hard time loving ourselves. And that's been, for teachers coming from the East, that's been very puzzling. How to teach us, how to make us do this practice. So for us, we'd start by sending good wishes to a loved one that rouses some of our capacity for love and empathy. And then we turn that same sense towards ourselves. The practice invites you to really send some wishes, which you can create your own. It's a very flexible practice. And then you turn those same good wishes towards yourself. And even a short practice done for a certain number of time, several weeks, even a very short practice daily can change drastically where you're at. So one other thing that the fly, fight, freeze response does is that it narrows your vision, literally, because your peripheral vision goes. Of course, if the thread is right in front of you, it's most effective if you're looking at the thread, not if you're considering the whole environment in that moment. But it also shuts down those centers in your brain that allow you to have perspective on any issue. And so it narrows you in a place that is then not helpful to problem solve what to do about something. So the more you're in your fly, fight, freeze space, the less creative and imaginative you are about taking action that is effective and productive. And so the more you can practice this openness of the heart, that also opens us to each other, which means also it's a self perpetrating towards goodness, health, and wellness practice, so to speak, because then the more we open to each other, the more we benefit each other, then we feel better, we open to each other even more, and we're actually much better able to assess who's worthy of trust when we're at that open space. We're not that good at assessing it when we're at that closed space. So it's actually not only it's not dangerous, it's much better to protect yourself when issues are a bit wider than a bear trying to eat you in the moment, it's actually much better to have an open heart because they're much better able to assess who's trustworthy and who's telling you the truth. But you can't very well do that because you're going to just estimate danger everywhere and just confirm your beliefs. That it's just our biology does that for us to protect us, just that we are no longer living just with bears.
Right.
So that's changing the game a little bit. Our biology hasn't changed yet. So that's where knowledge is power, what's happening to you. So I highly recommend that practice again, you can see it's a healing practice, but it's also a resistance practice. It's also an empowerment practice. So psychology can be used for good or for promoting, empowering, and promoting resistance and empowering towards action and justice. The same exact tools applied on a different target or under a different analysis can be used to perpetrate the status quo. And psychology certainly has had a long history, and counseling as well, of impacting and oppressing the very population that we are called to serve, and in fact we have not uplifted them. So I think we are all on a journey as clinicians to eradicate ourselves from a tradition that has not used the tools well or for good, and to really use them, because these are powerful tools. There are good tools. I'm not saying they're the only tools that people should use. There's much healing can happen in many different ways, beautiful ways. There are marvelous practices that have been cultivated for centuries through many traditions. In fact, we're borrowing many of them ourselves and doing our science confirmation around them. But the truth, there are lots of beautiful practices there that we might not be using. But insofar as our training is to use the psychology and counseling tools, they are really beautiful and powerful. And so we should use them with caution, and we should use them thoughtfully.
Thank you so much. Good information.
Yeah, I'll end with what popped into my mind was the whole concept of solidarity.
Yes. Yes. You know, once we truly accept that we cannot be well on our own at any level, then everything else becomes so much easier to access. Unfortunately, in the United States specifically, we have a very strong value around rugged individualism and around doing it on your own. And of course, performs a very specific function within the current power structure. The current, I mean, the last 400 years. So, you know, I'm from Italy, and I have a very long view of history. So Corinth is very large. That may not always mirror by so yes, unfortunately, it's biologically incorrect. We cannot be well on our own. In fact, I highly recommend folks to look at the CTZN, C as in cat, T as in Teresa, Z as in zebra, N as in Nancy, CTZN podcast. They put out a beautiful program called The Wellness Are We. And if you go to thewellnessarewe.com, the entire week was recorded and available for free. And they really talk about how do we move from this individual, I'm going to soothe my own feeling, to collective wellness, because we need collective wellness. We need the sense of solidarity to be truly well. The other resource I would like to give is if anybody has heard of Resmaa Menakem, there is on the 10% Happier podcast. He was one of the latest people being interviewed. His book is My Grandmother's Hands. It's one of the most, exactly. You probably heard of it. I'm going to pick up my copy today. I'm so excited. It was on back order. Every therapist and every trauma therapist is reading that book. But he does a really phenomenal, again, job at deconstructing much more than I've even done today, the layers of how we understand the trauma of injustice and how do we respond to it and how do we face it. So I highly recommend, especially for therapists, his conversation and his work.
Thank you for those resources.
You're welcome.
Mark, any other questions, or Eleonora, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Otherwise, we would just ask you to share your contact information for any of our listeners or viewers who wish to reach out to you.
Sure. I think my blog is a good resource in terms of all my thinking is there. So I left after 15 years in academia. I left, and one of my desires was to make free and available everything I've thought might be helpful. Nothing I've thought comes from within me. I just read voraciously, and I like to put things together and use the lens of social justice to do so. So I take no proprietary of the ideas. It's just the way of thinking, and again, put them in a model that is usable, and you don't always have to pay a lot of money to get that. And so I try to put on my blog everything that I think could be helpful and usable actively by individuals. So if you go on my website, again, it's dreleonorabartoli.com, and you can see hopefully my name, how it's spelled at the bottom of my Zoom square. So it's BR and then my name spelled the way you see it. And you can also follow me on social media. I have branched out into social media. I have a wonderful person who supported me in managing it. So you can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'm trying to post everything there. And lately I've started putting some of my blogs up on Medium. Medium is a blog site. It's a nationally sort of accessible blog site. One of the articles that I wrote there, which is getting the most visibility, is an open letter to white people who are asking what they can do to respond to racial injustice specifically. And so that letter, I jokingly say, 10 minutes for a lifetime of activism. Read the letter, you'll never have to ask the question ever again as a white person how to respond. So those are ways in which you can sort of access this kind of support that I might be able to offer to you. Right. And one dear colleague of mine said that I just like I follow the crumbs, when I to see where it leads me. So every resource I have becomes the next step. I also leave a trail of crumbs behind me. So those are my crumbs.
That's
hopefully
great.
lead somebody to the right place that's good for them.
I think we all need crumbs.
Yes, we all do. We all do. Exactly.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So much wonderful information. I'm sure we could talk much longer than the 30 minutes that we just have. So I think it would be great at some point to bring you back on our show, and we can just continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Any last thoughts? Any last thoughts that you would like to share with our community?
Love really does win.
Yeah.
It's biologically true.
Yeah. Mark, anything you would like to add before we end today?
I think our guest ended it very well, and I think it's a great place to end for today.
All right,
and
thank
just
you so
again,
much.
my personal thanks for coming and joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been delightful.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Eleonora, and thank you to all our listeners and viewers. Please feel free to reach out to us about today's episode, or if you have any thoughts on future topics or guests that you would like to have or see on our show. Have a wonderful day, everyone.